Hi. Hi, everybody. Am I there? Yep. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. Last time we had kind of an open session. We weren't able to get to our talks. Somebody was sick, and so we rescheduled those for tonight, and we're going to talk about those tonight. First up, we're going to have Nick Ciske, and he's going to be talking about functions and where to find fantastic functions and where to find them. So everybody, I'm hoping for some cool graphics, some cool GIFs maybe, some super fantastic functions. All right, thanks everybody.
All right. Here goes nothing, our first live streamed event. Hopefully there's some people watching online. Where I just spent the last couple days monkeying with hardware and computers for nothing. So my name is Nick Ciske. I'm the CTO here at LuminFire. And this is my WordCamp Lightning talk. I'll go a little slower for you guys since I don't have a time limit. And then we'll have some questions at the end. But my talk was on fantastic WordPress functions and where to find them. We've recently hired developers here that are newer to the WordPress ecosystem, and I've found that stuff that I thought everybody knew, everybody doesn't know. And so I've had to let them know, hey, there's a really cool function that does that. You should use it versus writing this loop or this other thing or doing it the hard way. And so I thought, man, this would be a great talk to kind of like let other people know. Here's some gems in the WordPress code base that you may not know about and might change the way you code your websites. So we already covered that. You're here at the user group. This was my plug to come to the user group. So if you came because of my talk, awesome. This is the room you're in now. And that's the foosball table. So, okay. So there's about 3,000 functions in WordPress core. A lot of those are internal functions you'll never ever touch because WordPress uses them internally. But there's a bunch of good ones that you might actually want to use in your theme development or your plugin development. I had a 10-minute time limit. I'm glad I don't have that tonight. So there was no way I was going to be able to cover all 3,000 functions in 10 minutes. So I picked 10 or 12 really good ones. So let's say that you or your client want to indicate on your blog that something was posted 5 days ago, 3 minutes ago, 4 years ago, instead of the date it was posted on. You might think, oh, I better go look for a function that does that, or a JavaScript function or something. But there's humane time diff, right, in WordPress core. So if you give it the current time and the time of the post, it'll give you the humane time, like 5 days ago, 34 weeks ago. It figures out the largest unit of time and gives you a nice rounded number that humans can kind of go, oh, this is an older post or this is a newer post. They don't have to be like, okay, how many months ago was that? Some people hate these because they say that now you're making me do math. So, but if you want it, there it is, right? In WordPress core, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's lots of form helpers in WordPress that are really super helpful. Something you do a lot when you're building a form is pre-filling the data that they filled in last time. And so you need to check things and select things and disable things based on the value from the database or the value from a post or something like that. And there's 3 functions called checked, selected, and disabled. So you pass it the value that you're expecting, the value that they put in, and whether or not you should echo it out. Because you can either echo it out to the browser or you can have it return. And what it's going to give you is something like checked equals checked, selected equals selected, disabled equals disabled. Now you may think, well, that's really silly. Like that's really easy to do an if statement on. But when you're building your forms, this is a lot clearer what you're doing there versus having this baked in if statement in every line of code. You can stick this in there and it's really clear that this is pre-selecting a value if it exists in the select list. Often you're uploading files to your server. WordPress does this a lot internally, magically in the WordPress media library. And if you upload the same file multiple times in the same month, or if you have the year and month thing turned off, you generally don't want to clobber the file. So if somebody uploads photo 1, it's probably not the same photo 1 they uploaded 2 years ago. So WordPress has this cool internal function called WP unique file name. And you'll probably notice that your computer does this too. If you download the same file multiple times, you get -1, -2, -3, -4, -5. So it doesn't clobber the file that's there. It adds an iterator on the end. So if you give it a unique file name, or if you give it a directory and a file name and extension, it'll return back to you the new file name. So if it doesn't exist, it returns the original file name. If it does, it actually iterates through and finds the highest value and gives you the next one. So it'll give you a safe file name to save that file. Sometimes you're like, hey, how big is that file? Here's a PowerPoint presentation or a PDF or a Word doc or a movie file. And you want to tell your user before they download it on their phone or on their crappy Wi-Fi connection or on their LTE that that's actually a 600 megabyte file. So you might go out and look for a PHP function that'll do that for you, but there's actually one in Core called size format. So if you do a size of, or a file size command on your file name and give it to size format, just like the human time diff, it'll make a human readable version of that. It'll go to megabytes, gigabytes, terabytes, depending on how big the file is. So it's going to give somebody a reasonable size estimation of how big that file is. Useful if you have like a download section or you're building an attachment page template or something like that. You can save yourself a loop a lot. WP list pluck. This might be my all-time favorite functions I found. So like, let's say, this happens a lot in WordPress. You query the database and you get back an array of objects, right? You get an array of users, an array of posts, an array of taxonomies, of taxonomy terms. You get arrays of objects all the time. And you're like, you know what? I really just need the user emails from that thing. I don't care about the rest of the data. I just want the user email. So normally you go, okay, I'll go do a for each and I'll loop through every one and I'll grab the property I want and I'll stick it in another array and then I'll return that array back and I've got my list of emails. Or you could do WP list pluck, give it your function that returns an array of objects and the property you want, and it'll do all the hard work for you. And all you get back is an array of the thing you asked for. Oh. I don't think you can. I haven't tried it. You can go look at the function reference if you want. It's really just for one field for I need the taxonomy term ID or I need the term name, and I don't care about the rest of the data. I just want to pluck that one item out of that list. It's super helpful, and it kind of keeps you from writing bad code because you can't screw it up, your for loop, and like grab the wrong thing or whatever. So there's lots of safety built in there. This is a more and more important one as SSL is becoming required by Google. Everybody know that in a couple months, if you have a form field on your website anywhere, Google Chrome is going to say your website is not secure unless SSL is enabled. Who knows that? Who learned that tonight? Who's going to go turn on SSL on their website tonight? Or maybe tomorrow? SSL is a huge deal. Google wants an all SSL internet, and they are willing to push via Chrome to make that happen. So right now, if you go to the login form on any WordPress website and you don't have SSL enabled, it's going to tell you, watch out, this is insecure, because it is. You're submitting your credentials in plain text. So if you don't have SSL yet, go figure out how to turn it on. You probably don't have to pay for it. Lots of hosts have Let's Encrypt, which is free. If not, you can install Let's Encrypt if you have VPS. If not, maybe go find a host that has a clue and switch to them, because they probably already offer Let's Encrypt.
For those of you that were at the WordCamp, is this the same thing that the fellow was talking about, getting rapid certificates?
Yep, that's Let's Encrypt. So it used to be you had to buy a 1 to 3 year certificate from a certificate authority like Komodo, VeriSign, Starfield, GoDaddy, whatever. And so the EFF, actually, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, said, this sucks. All they're doing is running an automated script that generates a file. Like, you shouldn't have to pay $60 for that. So they set up a free certificate authority called Let's Encrypt, and it lets you issue 90-day certificates. And if you automate that, it just renews every 90 days. You get free SSL for the rest of your life. It's pretty cool. Wildcard certs are coming. Right now, you can only do host names and subdomains. But, I kind of got on a tangent there, but it's an important thing. If you don't know how to do SSL, ask on the WordPress mailing list or on the Slack channel, and we'll help you out. But it's becoming increasingly important, and you should be talking to all your clients about turning SSL on their websites as well. It's a great little way to bill somebody. I think it's October 1st, yeah. It's coming up pretty quick.
Whenever the next version of Chrome.
Yeah, whenever the next major version of Chrome rolls out. It was January 1st was the login stuff that rolled around. So what you might want to do in your WordPress site is check if SSL is enabled and do something different, or output a thing saying, hey, you don't have SSL, you should call me so I can turn it on for you. Lots of people check server headers and do all kinds of hijinks to try and determine that. WordPress has a function called isSSL. It checks multiple headers to make sure that it's getting a right response. Because sometimes if you're at like WP Engine or Pantheon or another place that proxies requests, so they hit a load balancer and then they go back to the web server, the connection between the load balancer and the web server isn't secure because it's inside the network. And so it'll look like it's not secure, but it really is. And so there's a separate header that's sent that says, hey, I'm not secure, but my connection to the world is. So this function can tell the difference between the two and return true for proxied requests, essentially Nginx or Varnish. All right. If I lost anybody there, you can ask you can ask after.
And if anybody's done a lot of this lately, this would be a great talk for next month before it goes, into effect in October.
Yeah, there's lots of tools for resolving insecure content issues. There's one called Really Simple SSL that automates a lot of the SSL switching within WordPress to make sure that your site doesn't throw those, oops, you tried to serve something insecure on your secure page, so I didn't bother to grab it. So like you can break Google Analytics if you have it manually enabled. You can break other tracking cookies, things like that, if you don't have them enabled over SSL. This one's kind of cool. Let's say you have a block of text. You know there's links in it, but nobody bothered to link them. If you run it through Make Clickable, it'll find all the links and make them clickable. It doesn't give it a nice name, but it'll make the link a link to itself.
So any link to the whole site?
If anything you run through this function will come out the other end with an anchor tag wrapped around the URL with a link to itself. So it's great for like a directory site where somebody has a bio and they want to like mention some URLs in there. You can run it through Make Clickable, and it'll make any links clickable within their bio. It will work for emails too. So if there's emails in there, it'll make the emails clickable with a mail to link. If you're doing it on emails, I recommend you also install something like Cryptex. That's going to obfuscate that so spam bots don't pick it up. But that's up to you. Often we want to redirect users on our WordPress website. If they try and go in the back end and they shouldn't be in there, we want to redirect them. After they log in, we might want to redirect them somewhere. So there's WP Redirect, which a lot of people use, but it will redirect anybody anywhere, including to a Viagra site or a porn site or who knows what site. WP Safe Redirect will only redirect people to your website. It has to be URL on your website. And it has to be a protocol that is recognized by WordPress. So they can't try to pop up some weird application like.
Whenever we're doing any kind of development work, at the end of the day, we're always going to have to present it to someone, whether it's to a client, whether it's to a viewer on the website, or in any regard. It's always about communication. We're always having to present these ideas, and this is really troublesome. Let me see if I can get this to work properly. Anyways. I can try. Which one am I supposed to connect to?
What are your options?
Which one?
What?
Event space 1 or event space 2?
That's a good question. Try event space 1.
I need the code.
Try event space 2.
Still need a code. No, that's all you. They both still require a code.
There it is.
Okay, there it is.
17.
3, 4, 1, 7, 3, 4.
We just broadcast our code on the air.
Yes, we did. Okay. All right. Point being, we need to append a little bit to our title here. It's really more accurately, better communication saves money. So in the spirit of better communication, I'll introduce myself. Hi, I'm Jeronimo Lopez. I'm a web engineer. I have a passion for web development, GIS, which is mapping, essentially, and design. So those last two, GIS and design, have nothing to do with this talk. I just want to mention it because I really do love those things. Now, in the spirit of bad communication, the idea is that you have this hero, comes into town, he saves the day, and then he wanders off into the sunset, never to be seen again. So this guy, we have a name for him in the web development. His name is the cowboy coder. Okay, so let's say you want to have something done for your website, right? You find a guy, he says, hey, I can do that, right? He looks confident, he's got maybe a nice resume, maybe he's got a good portfolio, and you hire him on, and you know what? He does get it done. But later, maybe a couple months, maybe even the next day, something breaks, and you try to get in communication with the guy. Maybe you get him in there, and maybe he's able to fix it. Maybe not. You have to go find someone else. And you ask them, hey, can you fix this for me? And they give you that look, because they looked at the code. And they realized that last guy, he might have gotten it done, but he made a mess. Because when this guy comes into town to save the day, yeah, he saved the day, but maybe a couple of horses get shot, maybe a couple of people get shot, maybe a building gets destroyed, who knows, right? It got done, but there's always collateral. He's the guy you hire when you want to get something like this. I love this piece of code. Even if you're not, it doesn't matter if you're a developer or not a developer, you have no idea what's going on in there. I don't know what's going on in there. Well, that's not true. I do know what comes out of it. This code, it embodies, it's my absolute favorite code because it shows how you can do every single thing wrong, but still get it done right. Because this code, you put in some velocity, you change the gear, and it pops out the speed, right? So this is actually a piece of code that's simulating a car accelerating. And it works. You have to guess. It takes a lot of guesswork. You have to randomly toss in numbers, and eventually it'll give you your answer. But man, I would never. I worked with it once as part of a class assignment, a long time ago. Took me about maybe an hour, hour and a half, just to get the highest speed that thing could pop out. It's bad communication, and it's what happens when you hire a cowboy coder. It's what happens when you hire someone who's not considering the results. He's not considering the consequences. So Who here has ever written using the Cornell note system? Anybody? No? All right. I learned about this back in elementary school, I want to say. Never stuck with me. I don't particularly like to write notes for myself, you know? But it's actually a really good method, right? It essentially, for those of you who don't know, you have these two columns there. The one on the right here, you're supposed to write your actual notes, right? It's what's going on, what the teacher's saying, and so on. The column on the left, you're supposed to write, you know, sort of like keywords, key questions, like that. And then later on, you can come back, and you should be able to remember everything that happened just by reading the left column. The right one there is just for reference when you need to try to force yourself to remember. Then the next day, you come back, you look at those keywords, and at the bottom, you write a summary of the entire thing. So it forces you to kind of keep recalling and remembering things. Me, never liked to write notes. Because when I wrote these notes, it would be for myself. The moment I realized that notes were definitely a good thing to write was when, you know, a classmate leaned over and asked me, hey, can I borrow your notes? And I thought, I didn't write any notes. But I thought, you know, this could happen again. You know, I like to help people. It's in my nature. So I started writing some notes. And I got into this habit of making sure that when I wrote these notes, it was intended for those people. I know the way other people think. And I know that the way they think isn't necessarily the way I think. And this is really important when it comes to development work. Because when you write this little thing right here, this little comment, right, goes right above or below your code or wherever, you need to remember this. Context matters. Let's look back at this for a second. All right? Let's look at the top right portion here where it says 4 steps of learning cycle. Right? Let's say that I started with 2, absorbing. I look at absorbing. I just take that single line right there. I have no idea what that means. Absorbing. Why is it 2? I don't know. I look below it. 3, capturing. Still not sure. Look up. 1, preparing. I can see maybe a connection with it, but I don't understand. Then I get to 4, steps of learning cycle. And suddenly it clicks. It makes what we're looking at are the 3 key principles that I really want all of you to take out of this talk. First one, organization. So I started with 2, and that's why it didn't make much sense to begin with. If I read this all in order, starting with 4 steps of learning cycle, suddenly things become very clear very quickly. Everything needs to be organized in order for people to understand the order and cycle of things. 2, naming. Well, they're all names that I can understand. They all make sense, right? 4 steps of learning cycle, I can understand what that's getting at. If it had been abbreviated, say, LC, then again, I would be left with nothing to work with there. I would still be confused. Naming is just as vital as organization in order for people to understand the context of what's going on. Simplicity. Simplicity is also important here. So I could look at that entire thing, and it would take me a minute or 2 to go through it and to understand what's happening. The person could have written more notes, could have written less notes. Depending on how they do that would determine the amount of length and time that I spend going through it, right? And that takes us back to our original idea. The issue of money, the issue of time, the issue of communication. So let's look at this in context of actual development. Let's take our 4 steps of learning and make it into a bit of a program here. So for those of you that don't do much programming, the first one up there is a function, right? A function, you can imagine it as a sort of action. It's something that's done. You put something in there, and more often than not, something comes out or something is done to the thing you put in. So in this case, we're doing the learning cycle, and we're putting in brain. So we have our little note up there saying, perform 4 steps of learning cycle in order to learn. If we had just left it as learning cycle brain without that note, we wouldn't be entirely clear as to what's going on. The context there, placing it at the top of our code, giving it a reasonable name to the function, and making it sure that it's simple, the idea gets straight across to the user, makes this code already much easier to understand. So inside of our function, we have 4 other functions that are happening. We have prepare brain, absorb brain, capture brain, review, and apply brain. So again, we're cycling through all, and if we look through all of our functions down here, we can see that all of them have the same thing. They have a little note that explains what's going on. We go through it, we go through it, we go through it. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But the idea is just here that for the most basic idea when you're programming, the most fundamental thing you can do is to just explain those little details, just a little line to give you an idea of what's going on, where, and why. And the issue of organization occurs also within the code itself. Because if you notice, I start with the learning cycle, and then inside of the learning cycle, the events that occur are also written out outside of the learning cycle in the same. It's all about logic. It's all about the way that people view and understand things. So here's the thing, though. Programming is not that simple, right? Things become very big, very complicated, very fast, right? So we need other methods to kind of build off of this. We'll talk about here is this of a doc block. So if we look right up there, we can see that our function has changed, and the information we're giving about it has changed too. So we have this function, it's doing the learning cycle. Instead of giving it brain, we're also giving it knowledge, because now we're really kind of building out this idea, this metaphor. So inside this function, we're going to give it brain and knowledge. Then it's going to prepare, absorb, capture, review, and apply that brain and knowledge. And then eventually, it's going to get to this new one we created called test knowledge. All right? Well, if you're stepping into here, right, you're not entirely sure what knowledge you're supposed to get, right? Learning, maybe you can guess that it's supposed to be new knowledge, but maybe old. That little piece of information up there is kind of standard in the world of PHP, right? So there are other languages, other programming languages have their own standards, right? We're only going to look at this one example. You can go out, whatever language you look at. You can Google it, try to figure out what it is on your own. It's usually not that different. So in this case, we start that first line the same way we started previously, right? We give just like a one-line sample of what's going on there. Perform 4 steps of learning cycle in order to learn. But in this case, we have these little things right there. The @ symbols are saying param, and then return. So just to give you a little idea of how to read this, right? So that first one says param object brain repository that will maintain all information. Essentially, what we're telling the user here is that we're putting in something here. That's what param means. We're saying what kind of item it is. In this case, it's an object. And then we're saying what its name is. Here, it's brain. And then we give a little description of what it is. That will maintain all information. Second one, param knowledge new, that says new information that will be stored in brain. And the last one, return, is just giving you an idea of what comes out. It's a Boolean, so that means it's yes or no, true or false. And it says confirmation that knowledge has been retained. All right? So all of that is just giving an idea of what's going in, coming out, and it's just a simple way to keep people informed of all the information that's going on here. So let's move on for a second here. That piece of information there, I told you that it's for the user, right? But there are much more convenient ways of using it beyond just the users looking at your code. OK, so I'm going to switch over here to the browser. Ignore the multitude of tabs there. I have a problem. Just focus on this page for now. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Mental health. It's a big issue right now in WordPress and programming generally, right? We can talk about it. I'm willing to come forward. All right. So this right here, right? I have a little application that exists inside of my code editor, right? It's called PHP Documenter, I think. I actually completely forgot his name for a second there. Essentially what it does is that it looks at those lines of codes that I wrote, those little green doc blocks, right? And functions that I wrote out, and I have it set up is that I just hit, Control, just automatically this information for me. It'll generate a page, a document that contains the code that I built. And it gives you this information, right? It gives you the function. It gives you what goes in, what comes out. And right now it's very bare bones because the documentation I wrote, it's really not much. And the code I wrote is also not much. Just to give you an example of some more complex stuff you could do with it, right? Here's another one that's actually a sample from the website itself, right? So if you notice over here, it has a much more in-depth hierarchy here. You can just click around. You can find all of the examples and information that it gives you regarding it, right? And all of this can be just sort of procedurally generated based off of your code just by installing this application, PHP Documenter. In my case, integrating it with my code editor, and then just running the program that generates it, right? Really not complex, and if you have questions about that, we can also talk about it afterwards. But it's just one of the really beneficial things about following the standards within your language. Because even though this exists for PHP, it also exists for other languages, right? Doesn't matter whether you're looking at JavaScript or C++ or Java or any of those, right? They all have their own ways of generating documentation based off of your comments, code, what have you. But let's move a little bit away from the code itself and look at the idea of generating documents itself. So something really popular recently is Git books, right? So if you're writing your code, you're probably putting your code up into GitHub. Or if you're not, maybe you should, you know. I advise it. I think it's really useful. And the good thing about GitHub is that, you know, it introduced this method that allows you to write a bunch of using Markdown, right? Markdown is a very simple language that you can use to kind of generate documentation that, in this case, allows you to build something like this. This is actually kind of like the first example I found that was like highly rated for Git books. So you can just scroll through here, right? Gives you all this nice documentation, you know, talking, well, I guess in this case it's not documentation, it's pretty much a book in its own right. Explaining to you what is a front-end web developer and giving you links to all these different locations and all of that, right? And in reality, all of it is just these little documents right here, just all of these little things. So if I click on one, gives you the information that's stored there, and all it's doing is pulling it down. And because it's open source, people can add comments, they can make remarks, they can try to add, and they can change things, right? And it's a very beneficial source for people who are particularly working within large teams or groups, or are working with a project with people that are, you know, on the other side of the planet, right? Another sample of documentation I want to give, and this one's kind of like a meta documentation. I really love this. It's called DevDocs. Essentially what it does is that it grabs the documentation from a bunch of other programming languages, and it allows you to just search through them through here, right? So if I know that I am working with HTML, JavaScript, and PHP, and I'm looking for a function that does something very specific, like append, I can just type append, and then it searches through all of their documentation and pulls out that information, right? And one of the things I really like about this is that it also gives you a good idea of what better place to get it from than the source, right? But you know, this kind of links in with the next one, FAQs, right? So there's always going to be similar questions popping up between different people, right? And so in my opinion, one of the best ways of handling a one-on-one conversation with other people is to either record that information, to note it down, or to have some other ways of retrieving it, right? So that you can add it to an FAQ, and then the next time someone comes around, hey, you know, here's the answer, right? Sometimes they'll get offended that you redirected them somewhere else, but you know, you don't have infinite time. Another one is video documentation, right? This one definitely has its pros and its cons, particularly if the things that you're working on are changing constantly, right? If you record a video of you stepping through a program, stepping through a website, stepping through some mock-ups or designs, it may change pretty soon, in which case, you know, what do you do with this video? Do you completely redo the entire video? Do you add an addendum, edit it? You know, it's a lot of issues there. But it can be very beneficial if you know that what you're building is going to stay the same, right? And it's especially helpful for clients that may not be entirely tech savvy as to what's going on, or about the way that the website's laid out, or what you can do in the WordPress admin and all of that, right? Yeah.
When you say video, are you talking about capturing screen movements?
Yeah, pretty much like screen capture. I mean, in theory, you could also do it, with yourself literally talking on there, but that's entirely up to you. So one of the most important things about all of this, right, and we're getting close to the end because I don't want to bore all of you too much with this, is the issue of following standards, right? So all of these things, they don't really matter if you don't actually follow the standards, right? All of these things, all of these guidelines, all of these things, all the little things I said, right? I said them with the mindset that, hey, you might follow through with this, and you can pass this on, and then other people will follow through, and suddenly it becomes a standard, right? Well, standards are very useful, and particularly in regards to saving time and money, you'll want to create them and you'll want to follow them, right? You'll want to show new people that are coming into your organization, or you'll want to show them to say the next client over, right? Because when you build your FAQs, when you build your video tutorials, those things, right? You start to build a standard of how you're going to show clients how to go through all of these things. But standards, they're not always right. And it's something that you keep in mind also, right? You come into a new place, right? People do it a specific way. Maybe you do know better, right? And there's a balancing act here, right? Are you a cowboy coder? Are you a good coder? Are you just trying to do what's best for your client? Or what's going on there, right? And it becomes kind of a tricky balance, and you really kind of have to think in terms of the people that you're working with, the people that you're trying to inform, right? Just remember, it's all about communication, right? If it works for them, and if it makes a lot of sense for them, then you probably don't need to change it. But if you think you can explain them, then the standard is probably wrong. All right, so it's me again. I'm Jeronimo Lopez. I don't know why that's messed up, but sure. That's my name, email. Thank you. Any questions?
So for the documentation beyond like your comments, you carrying that over into variable names, function names, prefixes? Are you trying to maintain some kind of relationship between those functions? I'm thinking of a situation where like you have a function and you write it out, but then when somebody uses that function, maybe it doesn't get that comment that goes along with it.
Yeah. What? Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay. So the question is essentially, since a lot of times people will be using functions that don't have with them, right? So they're think Nick said functions that exist inside of WordPress that, hey, you know this function exists, but you don't know what it does or how it works, right? Well, yeah, you definitely want to make sure to name your variables and your functions in ways that are logical and reasonable, right? So you want to create sort of theming, I guess. So I guess one issue that comes up a lot is the issue of, whether you write your variables with the mindset of brevity versus, meaning. I always go on the side of meaning, honestly. Especially if you're working with back-end stuff, size doesn't really matter too much. Yes, if you're working with JavaScript, you think you want to have like shorter names because it saves space. But in reality, if you're writing good code on the front end for JavaScript, you probably want to minify your code anyways, right? So for those who don't know, minification is essentially when you run it through a program or a process that essentially shortens all of your variables and your names as much as it can so that it loads faster on the website. Well, in most cases, you can write long names. You can write names that are, maybe groups, like maybe they have subtitles on there, something that you can connect them with. One particular benefit is name spacing, right? PHP in regards to WordPress doesn't use namespacing too much yet because there's still issues with backwards compatibility and all those kinds of things. But namespacing is essentially when you produce like, I wouldn't really call it a variable, but a location at the top of your code where you specify all of the functions, all of the variables here exist within the context of this line, right? And then you can make it a bit more understandable for people because you give your context as something that makes a lot of sense, right? So your context is, say, automobile, and then you create your functions inside of there that says, drive forward, drive backward, or whatever, right? And so in that regard, try to give your name some meaning. Any other questions? Yeah.
I hear what you're saying with my programmer hat on, and it's great information, so thank you. There's another hat I wear, which is communicating with clients and picking up websites that clients are handing me from other developers.
Yeah.
And there's this whole other layer of information about, like, what's the host? What are the credentials for the host or the name server? Why are these plugins being used? A whole lot of thinking goes into constructing a WordPress site that in my experience, when I'm picking up sites that others have created, is usually completely undocumented.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have strategies for how to document that sort of layer of information, or if anybody else in the room does, or if that might be a topic we could talk about maybe at a future meeting too. Because we do one thing in our practice, we tend to create a Google Doc of this kind of information, hand-on to the client and hopefully future developers. Is there a better way, or?
Well, within our organization, actually, I need to repeat the question. For other information that's typically not stored within the code, like passwords, hosting, and that kind of stuff, how do you ensure that that gets documented and saved for other people to view? Well, within our organization, right, we do two things, right? One, we host most of our projects through Basecamp, right, which allows us to have one central repository between communication with the clients and ourselves, right? Within that repository, within the Basecamp, we're able to create, notes that are apparent there for the project and anybody who comes in that, they can view that information. So if need be, we can store some information there about hosting and whatnot. We also tend to use 1Password as a method of securing passwords. So because 1Password gives you the option of sharing passwords within your organization if you pay for that, we're able to store all of our passwords there, and then we can say, hey, you can go to 1Password, you can search up the website name, and it's like, okay, hey, that's how you find that information. I mean, that's all within the organization itself, right? I guess the bigger issue is when you go outside of the organization and it's handed off to someone else. Well, I mean, the good thing about keeping everything within one central location is the fact that, yeah, you can just hand that off to the client when you're done, right? I think that's something that I think we as coders or we as developers are responsible for, because more often than not, the client is not going to bother to remember that, hey, I have a hosting service and I need to remember the information there. More often than not, that information passes through their email, or hopefully not their email, but passes by them once, and then they don't recall it. There's really not much you can do if that other person, that other coder out there didn't do, besides trying to get in contact with them. What you can do for yourself and you take responsibility for. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I sort of have a question that spans the two talks.
Okay.
That is related to the functions of WordPress codex as well as to looking at documentation or accessing documentation. So for anyone who uses Sublime Text, and I know this is kind of a specific question, but swap back and forth between code editor and browser all the time. So I don't know if anyone has any personal tools that they recommend.
I think you should switch to Visual Studio Code. I think there's a module for that.
Yeah. Me
I don't
personally-
know. Do you know of one, Marty?
No, I mean, in app, I use one that auto completes.
Yeah, I thought there was one that was like about doc blocks specifically or something that we put in function. It would bring you the whole function with like the doc block with the comments in there.
Google it, because that's apparently.
Did not have a ton of WordPress specific modules, but I know some ones that do that are very helpful.
But if there's a doc block one, all of WordPress internally has doc blocks.
The one that I have used and do like, which is kind of similar to something you showed, is an app for Mac called Dash. And it has integrations for add-ins, Sublime Text, PHP Storm and stuff.
Is that back from the dead?
With Dash,
Yeah, it got pulled from the App Store. Yeah, I don't know if it ever came back.
I think it still exists, I still use it. But that's a really nice way of looking stuff up in terms of centralized.
The Mac version ever was on the App Store?
It was, and it got pulled. Oh, there's a non-App Store version, so you, if you download that one, it works. Okay. Anything to contribute there, Jeronimo?
Oh, sorry.
You don't have to. You're just
I
standing
use
up there.
PHP Storm. I really like it. It's a pretty good IDE. My advice is find someone who is a student and just use their email account to download whatever IDEs they have free access to. I use my wife's account to access PHP Storm. I used my own personal student email account a while back. So, I mean, most of that material is available as a student, and at the very least, I know for PHP Storm, it doesn't have restrictions about using it for, for clients and stuff like that. At the very least, so I mean, that is something you need to consider.
Careful, man. We are live streaming.
I know. Don't worry.
pirate software. Read the EULA.
Yeah, exactly. What?